All right, welcome back from the episode of Two Plane Sports. Today, we are joined by Parker Thune from OU Insider, another great guest that we're having on back-to-back interviews on our last two videos. And we just want to say, welcome to the show. How are you doing tonight or this morning, Parker?
Hey, doing fantastic. Great to be with you guys. Really appreciate it.
Good. So, but before we get into it, we just want to say we really appreciate it. If you found the video for the first time, you've been watching multiple times, you might as well hit the subscribe button. It helps us out a ton. It's free. Turn the notification bell so you know when we're going to go live, post new videos Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. Central, 9:30 Central. And we will be going live at 8 p.m. Central on July 9th. So be sure to put that on your calendar. And, like the video, comment, stay around for Brandon's Indie Video Challenge. And if you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify, leave us a review and let us know what you think. It helps us out, spreads the word, and we'll get into it today. Parker, we're going to be talking a lot of recruitment. A lot of things have been happening in the month of July and even in the end of June. I think we can start with the most recent commit in Pettaway. Joining the fold. It seemed like for a while he wasn't going the Sooners' way over the last few months, and then as of recently, in the last month or so, it seemed like it really came back in the fold. Harrison Pilot kind of was trending away, and it seemed like Pettaway just came right back, and he pulled the trigger and joined the team. What do you think about his commitment and what he can provide to the team?
Yeah, well, you brought up Mikhail Harrison Pilot right there, and an interesting situation between him and Oklahoma. The initial plan was for him to take an official visit over the summer, and then Oklahoma kind of slowed his roll on all that. And that was part of the reason that he started to trend more in Texas's favor than Oklahoma's, when it looked like for the longest time he was a strong OU lean. And I think a lot of that had to do with the steady confidence that was building behind the scenes that the Sooners were going to end up with a commitment from Jaquaize Pettaway. Now, Pettaway is one of the quietest kids in the entire 2023 recruiting cycle. So in order to get reliable intel on him, you really had to have a strong handle on the people around him, because you just weren't really going to get much from the horse's mouth in regard to Pettaway's recruitment. But very quietly, like I said, behind the scenes for a period of months, the Sooners were making more and more progress in his recruitment, to the point where as early as April, I would say the Sooners had positioned themselves as the leader. He obviously took an official visit for the Champion Barbecue at the beginning of June. I don't believe he ended up making the trip to Ole Miss that following week, if my memory serves me correctly. And then he did end up taking an official visit to Texas. And that was why it came down to the Sooners and the Longhorns. In the end, those were the two schools that he had visited officially. But OU always had the upper hand over the Longhorns, even in the aftermath of Arch Manning's commitment. I was told Jaquaize Pettaway actually called Jackson Arnold to reassure him that despite the momentum that Texas had garnered in the aftermath of Arch Manning's pledge, he still was favoring Oklahoma in the aftermath of that. And so he obviously jumps into the fold on the 6th of July as the Sooners' 12th commit of the cycle. And I think when you look at what he brings to the table, man, he is so elusive and so fast. And I made the Mario Williams comparison last week. And, that may be kind of a sore spot for some fans, because Mario Williams just obviously turned tail and headed out west for USC after one season in the Crimson and Cream. But I think Pettaway has the chance to make the same type of impact as a true freshman. He is, as I mentioned, one of the fastest players at the prep level in America, 10.4 in the 100 meters. And when you turn on the tape, you see how that manifests on the football field. He's got speed that translates to a game environment. That isn't always the case. You get some guys that are fast, but they aren't football fast. Jaquaize Pettaway is both fast and football fast. And so I think he projects as a pretty immediate situational guy offensively for Oklahoma as a true freshman. I do think he gets plenty of run in the return game, depending on what the picture looks like at that point, as far as what kind of capable returners are left on the roster at Oklahoma by the time he enrolls. But obviously the number 47 player in the nation per the 24/7 Sports composite. This is a game changer at the wide receiver position. And he is right now knocking on the door of 5-star status. I don't want to say he does pick up that 5th star. I think once you get to a certain point, it's very, very difficult to climb any higher unless you're a quarterback or I would say a defensive lineman. Those are really the two positions where you have a lot of upward mobility, even past that 50 to 100 range this late in the cycle. But as things stand, Jaquaize Pettaway is one of the top 10 wideouts in the country, and I expect that he'll stay right in that same territory. Very, very high 4-star end of the spectrum. Phenomenal get for Oklahoma and a really crucial head-to-head recruiting victory over Texas.
We're huge fans of Jaquaize Pettaway in this show. We had a live about a week ago, and we talked to him for a long time, but let's kind of keep it in the receiver room. I know Jackson Arnold put a tweet out about a week ago talking about Anthony Evans and Jaden Greathouse. Where do you think Oklahoma sits with those two?
Yeah, I've never really bought into OU's chances with Greathouse. It seemed for the longest time like he was either going to end up at Texas or he was going to end up at Notre Dame. Seems to be leaning pretty heavily in favor of the Irish right now, and I believe his commitment date is not too far off. So he seems Notre Dame bound unless something changes pretty drastically. But I expect that Greathouse will be committed and Marcus Freeman and the Fighting Irish when all is said and done. Anthony Evans is an interesting case because the reason he decommitted from Arkansas in the first place was because of Oklahoma. OU wanted to bring him on a visit and offer him, which they did. But in order to do so, I think, I don't know what the exact specifics of Arkansas's philosophy on all that is, but Anthony Evans ended up decommitting from Arkansas and then taking the visit to Oklahoma. So OU was pretty instrumental in his decision to decommit in the first place. But in the aftermath, you saw Georgia jump in on Anthony Evans. You saw Penn State jump in. Texas A&M has recently offered. He just released a top 4 and set a commitment date for late August. It's going to be Oklahoma, Georgia, Penn State, or who am I leaving out there? Texas A&M. That would be the 4th. I really don't expect that Texas A&M is going to be the spot, mostly because his teammate, Johnny Bowens, 4-star defensive lineman, also from Converse Judson, just decommitted from A&M. I get the sneaking sense that OU may be in play for both of those guys. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that they're a package deal because that's a lot more uncommon than most anyone wants to acknowledge or admit. It's not often you get a true package deal. So I'm not saying that's what this is with Anthony Evans and Johnny Bowens, but I think if the opportunity is there for them to play together at the next level, I think that's a possibility that they will give a strong look at. And I think that opportunity exists at Oklahoma. They offered Johnny Bowens the morning after he decommitted from Texas A&M. Right now, I think the Sooners lead for Anthony Evans, who, much like Pettaway, one of the fastest players at any position in this entire recruiting cycle. So there's a long way to go. And I want to acknowledge that up front. We're still sitting, 7 weeks away from Anthony Evans' commitment date. A lot can change in that span of time, but you have to like where the Sooners sit at the moment.
Talking about defensive line here for a little bit, it seems like when Venables came in as a head coach, bringing in Todd Bates as the defensive line, guy, the tide kind of turned with how the recruitment of that specific position was going to be, including with Chavis being part of that squad. Is that something that us as fans are right in feeling? Have you seen a lot of defensive linemen kind of look at Oklahoma more of a destination for them now that Lincoln Riley and Alex Grinch have left?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you saw that at the end of the 2022 cycle when Miguel Chavis ended up with 3 commits, Grayson Halton, R. Mason Thomas, and Cavante Henry, that weren't even given a second thought to Oklahoma. Weren't even given a first thought to Oklahoma because they didn't even have offers until the new staff got to town in early December. So Miguel Chavis got his boots on the ground in Norman, Oklahoma, and had to hit the trail hard. He did. In the span of 2 months, he brought in 3 blue chip guys at the edge position. I think Halton projects to be more of an inside guy, but that's semantics, obviously. In Chavis and in Todd Bates and in Brent Venables, you have a dynamic recruiting trio and a trio that's going to be able to bring in a lot of elite talent along the defensive line. I really like where things sit right now. Really, really like where things sit between Oklahoma and PJ Adebawore, the 4-star edge rusher out of North Kansas City High. That is a kid that has one of the highest physical ceilings of anyone in the 2023 class, regardless of position. And the measurables are impressive. 6'5", 240, looks like he was chiseled out of stone, but the wingspan is what makes him so impressive. 7'1" wingspan on PJ Atabare. So if Oklahoma is able to close on him here, which I think they do, and I think it happens pretty imminently here, that's a huge addition for Miguel Chavis and that group on the edge, because Atabare is a guy, you get him in the system day one, he can be an impact contributor. Then the question becomes, who else is there at the position? Who else do you get off the edge in the 2023 cycle? Now, another guy that Oklahoma is in a sneaky good spot for is Cecilia Kana, 4-star edge rusher out of Lehigh, Utah. And he has not taken any official visits. He will be in Norman for July 20, or for the party on the Palace on July 29th. And here's how it was phrased to me by one source. Venables every year, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this source told me basically Venables every year picks one guy that he kind of puts a red eye on and personally invests in recruiting. Generally, he gets that guy. And this year, Cecilia Kana is that guy. So if you have faith in Brent Venables as a recruiter, you have a lot of faith that Cecilia Kana ends up wearing the crimson and cream. Now, when you're looking at the interior picture, obviously there's a growing belief that Oklahoma is going to be the destination for 4-star defensive lineman Derek LeBlanc out of Osceola, Florida. Beyond that, it's tough to say who else the Sooners get, because I don't know that there's one prospect that's real easy to identify as one that the Sooners ostensibly lead for. Now, they're in it for Amari Washington. They're in it for Kelby Collins. They're in it for Edric Hill and Johnny Bowens, whom I just mentioned. But beyond Derek LeBlanc, the Sooners have cast a pretty broad net as far as who else they're going to bring in on the interior defensive line. Obviously, Todd Bates is a guy that has paid his dues. He's earned his stripes. He's going to bring in an elite class. You got to throw David Hicks in the mix as well. And I'm still approaching that with a little bit of caution, but Oklahoma is very alive in the race for his commitment. Now, I've said it many times. I think David Hicks is the best prospect, regardless of position, in the entire 2023 cycle. And he's going to be a day one game changer and an absolute monster wherever he goes. That is that he could end up being the best defensive lineman that Oklahoma has had on their roster since Gerald McCoy. And you're talking about a guy that went 3rd overall in the NFL draft. So that's pretty elite company if you get the next Gerald McCoy in David Hicks. But again, Sooners are going to have to do battle with Oregon and Alabama and Miami and Texas A&M and Michigan State. It's not going to come easy. But again, when you look at what Todd Bates has done at Clemson over the years, there's a very good chance that regardless of whether the class includes David Hicks or not, we are wrapping this cycle come February and oohing and eyeing at the job that Todd Bates has done with regard to recruiting interior defensive linemen in the 2023 cycle.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, the old staff, I definitely, and I assume you would agree with me that a lot of these races, OU would not probably be up in the top 5, top 3 for a lot of these players. Someone, you kind of went over and talked over a few of them. I was going to ask, do you know much about Kelby Collins? I saw him tweet out, Boomer Sooner not too long ago. And also Jordan Renaud, I think they say it Renaud from
Renaud.
Tyler, Texas. It seems like, but for him, it's between Alabama and Oklahoma. That's another interior battle, along the defensive line. Do you really know much about Kelby Collins or Renaud?
Yeah. So here's what I can say about Kelby Collins, right? He posts about Oklahoma a lot, but there's a decent chance that you see guys do that with varying degrees of actual interest in Oklahoma. Some of them are serious. Like obviously a guy like David Stone is very serious about the University of Oklahoma, but some guys just know how ardent the Oklahoma fan base is. And they're trying to farm followers, right? They're trying to get people engaging with their content on social media. And so where I stand in the Kelby Collins recruitment I'm not disavowing the notion that Todd Bates and Oklahoma are in it, because they are. They made Kelby Collins as top 5. But before I get too confident about the Sooners' chances, I got to see him make an official visit. That's kind of where I stand on all of it. If Kelby Collins makes an official visit, then I'll start to believe that OU's legitimately in that one as a lead contender. With Jordan Renaud, I think there are 2 players in this class right now that I look at, and they're in virtually identical situations in as far as the state of their recruitment. Jordan Renaud and Makari Vickers at this point in time are both a coin flip between OU and Alabama. And I think it ultimately comes down to wherever they end up visiting last. And maybe that's an oversimplified way to look at things, but there's a chance they get Makari Vickers and or Jordan Renaud back on campus sometime in the late summer or fall. I would imagine they're going to make a play to get both guys back on campus at the party in the Palace. That just seems logical at this point. And so if they succeed in doing that, and maybe that kicks the can down the road and Alabama starts to fill up on the defensive line and in the defensive backfield, then you start to favor Oklahoma for Jordan Renaud and Makari Vickers. But if either or both of those two wind up down at Alabama again at some point, it's going to be really hard to say no to Nick Saban if he gets a second crack at you. So I'm kind of in a wait and see mode with those two. I'm more confident with Vickers right now as it pertains to Oklahoma than I am with Renaud, especially since Alabama just got commitments from 2 5-star cornerbacks and Jaleel Hurley and Tony Mitchell. I would say Oklahoma right now is probably the spot for Vickers, but things can change so quickly in the world of recruiting. I really do think it comes down to whether OU or Alabama can get either or both of those guys back on campus, potentially multiple times come the late summer/fall. So follow the visits on those two.
I've got a question about in-state recruiting because, I mean, I'm not too worried about it, but a lot of people you see on Twitter freaking out about, we lose out on Cole Adams. He commits to Arkansas. Our hat is on the table for Joby, but he's trending towards Michigan State. So losing out on Cole Adams, potentially losing out on Joby, is that, do you think, kind of the lack of the previous staff recruiting them early on, or is it unrelated to that? Is it just we kind of just lost out on that?
It's kind of the imperfect storm of circumstances, if I can put it that way, because with Job, the reality is he's not an Okie, right? He's from Senegal, Africa. He didn't even know what football was until a couple years ago. And now he's one of the top 100 prospects in the nation in the sport. But what I'm getting at with that is Oklahoma doesn't have the same sway. It doesn't have the same allure to a kid like Job as it does to your conventional Oklahoma kid, because for the most part, a solid 60 to 70% of the guys that make anything of themselves in the sport of football in the state of Oklahoma, they come up diehard Sooner fans, right? They come up with the dream of playing football at the Palace on the Prairie. That's just never been Job. And so I'm really not surprised that things have started to trend away from OU in his recruitment. I just think you have to chalk that one up to circumstances because, again, if he's a typical Oklahoma kid, you're probably getting him, especially with what a job Miguel Chavis has done in that recruitment. But he's not a typical Oklahoma kid. Now, with Cole Adams and with Micah Tease and with Luke Haas, those are the other three that a lot of folks are going to look back on this class and they're going to wonder if they don't know any better, they'll wonder, well, how on earth did OU not get those kids? Well, Luke Haas, the 4-star tight end out of Bixby, he comes from a family that is very pro Arkansas. He comes from a Razorback lineage, and he was committed to Lincoln Riley. He wasn't committed to OU. He was one of those kids, right? And you saw plenty of those kids pretty immediately decommit in the aftermath of Riley's move to USC. Malachi Nelson was committed to Lincoln Riley. He was absolutely not committed to OU, and that's the boat that Haas was in. And so the second that Riley left OU, he was going to Arkansas, and there's not a whole lot anybody can do at that point. Now, with Micah Tease and with Cole Adams, the common denominator there is Adams, of course, is a wide receiver. Tease wanted to be a wide receiver. He can play both sides of the ball at the next level, and he's equally capable of playing both. Well, the Oklahoma staff, the new staff, wanted Micah Tease to play defensive back. He kind of favored his long-term potential at wide receiver and wanted to play that position at the collegiate level a little bit more. And they just never could really jive. And he and the new staff at Oklahoma could never really come to an agreement as to how he was going to be used at the next level. So they kind of agreed to go their separate ways. And he ends up at Arkansas as well. With Adams, it's simply a case of OU waiting too long to offer the kid. And that's the one that you can't really make an excuse for. But I'll add this. if there's one position where Oklahoma is never going to be hurting for talent, it's wide receiver. So if there's one position where you could afford to have an in-state blue chip kid and you can afford to ostensibly make something of a mistake and dragging your feet too long to the point where he ends up at Alabama instead of OU, you can afford to do that with wide receivers because there's never going to be any shortage of elite wideouts that want to come catch passes at the University of Oklahoma. So I don't hold all the cards. It's Cale Gundy and Brent Venables' responsibility to recruit the wide receivers. They are way better at their job than I will ever be at mine. And they're certainly way better at their job than I would ever be at theirs. So it's one of those deals where you got to have a little bit of faith in the coaching staff's priorities and trust that they're going to be okay at the wide receiver position, regardless of where Cole Adams would have ended up.
Quick follow-up to that. Are you getting back on Cale Gundy's good side? Are you working towards that?
I have been unblocked. So step one is complete.
That's always
that's
good.
Awesome.
It's never going to be blocked by a coach, especially, in your position where you kind of got to be close to them or at least in the circle.
Hey, we exchanged DMs. We've smoothed it all over. We're good. So
that's good to hear. And going to talking about a more specific player like Brum was alluding to earlier, I want to hear your thoughts on Bowles, the linebacker. He recently came out with his top 3. Oklahoma's in it. I don't know. To me, it kind of seemed like when Oklahoma was even in his top, I believe he came out with a top 8. It was seemingly out of nowhere, and maybe because of Venables being such a great linebacker coach. Do you believe that is why we're still in the mix for him? Because it really seems from the outside looking in, his recruitment's been pretty silent, at least in regards to what is known by recruiting insiders.
Yeah, no, it's all Brent Venables. That's the reason why Oklahoma is still in that race. It is 100% on the shoulders of Brent Venables. The fact that Oklahoma is in Troy Bowles' final 3 is a credit to Brent Venables 1,000%. Now, heading into his announcement, which is going to come on July 16th, so next Saturday, I get the impression as much as it sucks to acknowledge and as much as it sucks to hear if you're an Oklahoma fan, I get the impression that OU is a hat on the table for Troy Bowles, and it's going to be either Georgia or Ohio State. That said, I will say this. There's a subtle confidence around Norman that Oklahoma is legitimately in this thing. Where I stand on it, this is the approach I took with Richard Young for months and months and months when everybody was wondering, hey, is OU really in this thing? Are they going to be in it to the end with Richard Young? The stance I always took with Richard Young was keep your expectations subdued and allow yourself to be very pleasantly surprised if he shocks the world and picks Oklahoma. That's kind of where I'm at with Troy Bowles. Not saying Oklahoma is out of the mix right now because they're not. And again, tip of the cap to Brent Venables in that regard. But don't go into next Saturday with particularly high expectations or a belief that Oklahoma is going to get Troy Bowles. Look at it from the perspective of, okay, it's probably going to be Georgia. It's maybe going to be Ohio State. But hey, if it's Oklahoma, guess what? That's another top 50 player that's coming to Norman as part of this quickly growing 2023 chosen class. And it's a player that we can get really excited about. I mean, he's got football in his DNA. He's Todd Bowles' son. So if Brent Venables can close on Troy Bowles, awesome. That is a cornerstone building block of your recruiting class. If you can get him to Norman, I'm just not counting on it right now.
That's fair. That's kind of what we've talked about, that, that's kind of our gut feeling on that. And, keep the expectations low and you might be pleasantly surprised. I want to ask you about another linebacker that I feel like OU's at least in a good spot for, maybe not a great spot, but I'm not 100% sure, is Lewis Carter. It seems like OU's really in this. Just from an outside looking in, I feel like OU has a legitimate shot, and they could have Carter, Omosigo, and Picchiotti join the fold. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty good trio at linebacker.
No, it is, and I'll tell you this much: that's real. That's real between OU and Lewis Carter. The interest there is mutual, and it is very real. And again, Brent Venables is the primary driving force in that regard. And you look at the upper echelon, you look at the peloton right now in Lewis Carter's recruitment. It's OU, it's Auburn, and it's North Carolina. And based on the conversations I've had with folks who know that recruitment and know that situation, Carter, much like Bowles, is another real quiet kid, and you don't get a whole lot from the horse's mouth. But there's a belief that OU is the leader there, and that's not super surprising because Auburn's entire coaching staff could be gone by the end of the year or before then. And North Carolina, I'm not trying to take a stab at Mac Brown in North Carolina, but that's not an elite football program, right? They're consistent and they win consistently. They'll win 8 or 9 games every single year, but they don't have the same prestige and tradition and gravity as a brand that Oklahoma does. And so if they can continue to sustain their current momentum with Lewis Carter, I think that's the 4th member of your linebacker core in this 2023 cycle. That's a pretty dang good haul in Brent Venables' first year as Oklahoma's head coach, because Phil Picciotti will be a 5-star. Samuel Omas, I'm sorry, not a 5-star. He'll be a 4-star. Oh boy, I almost completely overshot expectations. But Phil Picciotti will be a 4-star. Samuel Omasigo will also be a 4-star. There's a very good chance Caleb Spencer ends up being a 4-star as well. And so if you can add another 4-star to the mix in Lewis Carter, and you got 4 guys that have Brent Venables' stamp of approval, you're putting faith in all 4 of those guys, because if Venables is handpicking guys to play linebacker for him, and you look at his resume, you look at how much success he has had developing linebackers, you will give him more than the benefit of the doubt in that regard in terms of evaluating talent.
Brandon?
You go first.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about it before with Drum, but maybe I just didn't hear it. With, how NILs has become such a big part, at least, with how fans talk about it and how some people believe it's ruining college football. Do you hear that has been a factor for some individual people, or is it really just every school kind of has to put their hat in that ring and hope that they're not being outbid by other universities?
No, well, it's certainly a factor. And, it's one of those things that we can talk openly about now, money factoring into recruiting, because look, it's been this way for years. It's just something that we can openly acknowledge now. And so there are schools that are playing the NIL game with more fervor than others right now. And I think we're going to see in 2 to 3 years, that's kind of the window that I'm looking at as to the payoff of what that strategy ends up being, because right now there's no empirical data to suggest that buying a recruiting class or recruiting primarily around the promise of NIL dollars is going to result in success on the football field. There's no data that would suggest that. And obviously, logically you would think, well, if you're getting better players, you're getting better talent equals more wins, right? But you have to understand the mental and the cognitive aspect of all of this. If kids are coming for the money, they're going to leave for the money too, right? And it's easier than ever before to leave when you have the transfer portal as an option anytime you want to access it. Moreover, if kids are coming for the money, well, how much of a team-oriented attitude are they going to have? Because if they're coming for the money, it's about them. It's not about the team. And so there's all sorts of different cognitive angles to all of this. And I will be intrigued to see in 2 to 3 years where this road takes us with NIL, because there are programs right now that are shelling out millions and millions upon millions of dollars to bring in some of the best recruiting classes that their school has ever seen. In some cases, because they feel like they've exhausted all their other alternatives, right? They feel like, well, we haven't been able to build a championship program by any other means over the course of our decades of existence. So you know what? This is new. We can get ahead of the curve here. Let's give it a try. Let's see if we can break through. And to a certain extent, you can't fault those programs, but I think the stance that Oklahoma has taken amidst all of it is rather wise, which is, yeah, we're going to play the game and it's not going to be completely absent from our recruiting pitch, but we're not going to make it the meat and potatoes of it, because we're not going to make Oklahoma the NIL destination. Oklahoma is a destination in and of itself. So we don't have to position NIL as the main draw to the University of Oklahoma. Our main draw is 7 national titles, 50 conference championships, and a head coach who's been in the business for 29 years and has never been a part of a losing football team, a football team that hasn't made a bowl game. That's the draw at the University of Oklahoma. So again, I don't know where this takes us 2 to 3 years down the road, but I don't question that Oklahoma is going to be just fine any way you slice it.
Yeah, and I heard something interesting from someone earlier today that, eventually, like a school like Miami, right? It's reported that Rashada got like 9.5 million and Imaleva got 8 million from Tennessee. At some point, you're going to start seeing all these busts, and fan base are going to say, well, they overpaid, and it's going to start being a meme in social media, and schools and their boosters are going to acknowledge, right? All right, maybe we shouldn't be shelling out $8 million for an 18-year-old kid who we actually haven't watched play a snap at the college football level. So I think you're right in that 2 to 3 year window where it's going to level itself out eventually, and maybe more of a what it should be with, all right, you've proven yourself to our university. Here's $1 million or $2 million, however a booster would evaluate them at that point.
Yeah, no, exactly. And when you look at a program like Miami that hasn't made it a secret that they're delving into the NIL game, you look at a program like an Arkansas or a Texas A&M or even an Oregon, right? And you don't, and I know you brought up the $8 million deal between Nico Iamaleava and Tennessee. The market for quarterbacks is going to be massive over the next couple of years. But what you also have to keep in mind is there's probably going to be a market correction at some point in time, because when you're paying for a good or service, you want to know you're getting a return on investment, right? So how many of the stakeholders, how many of the folks that are writing the checks are going to become disenfranchised if the guys that they're paying aren't seeing the field or aren't contributing at an elite level within a year or two? Because let's face it, guys, the vast majority of college football players don't contribute meaningfully in their first 2 seasons at the collegiate level. That's not something that happens. That is the exception. That's not the rule. And so I would imagine that at a certain point, the folks that are signing the checks are going to get a little antsy because of the delayed ROI and the reality that the guys that they're paying money to can bounce at any time via the transfer portal if there's more money on the table elsewhere. I mean, and believe me, that will happen. It's already happening. Don't let anyone convince you that Jordan Addison went to USC for any reason other than the money, right? It was set in place before he ever hit the transfer portal, and you don't have to look any further than Pete Thamel's reporting on the matter to glean that. So it is a wild, wild world right now as far as NIL is concerned, and I don't think we're too far removed from things getting reined in a little bit, whether by virtue of legislation or by virtue of simple market correction.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting, and it's something to keep an eye on, and as the years go by. But in the more immediate future, so for those who are watching, it's Friday morning right now. We have Caden Green announcing at 5:00 today. On this show, we feel pretty good about it. I know we talked to you earlier before we start recording. You feel pretty good. But the offensive line position, to stick there, is one of our favorite positions on the show. We talk about all the time. And 2 guys that we talk a lot about is Peyton Kirkland and Logan Howland. Where do you think Oklahoma sits with those guys?
Yeah, so Logan Howland is going to be announcing tomorrow, Saturday, July the 9th. So it is down to Oklahoma and it's down to Iowa in that recruiting battle. I'm favoring Oklahoma right now in Logan Howland's recruitment. That one has been very fluid for the last couple of weeks. It's OU and then it's Iowa and then it's OU and then it's Iowa. I do think as we get closer and closer to decision day, I think OU has taken a pretty safe lead there, but I'm not taking that one to the bank quite yet. I don't think. I do have a crystal ball in for Oklahoma. So that tells you where I'm at with it. It's not a lock, and I don't want to make it seem like it is, but there's reason to believe that OU will be the spot for Logan Howland. You're obviously looking at a decision from Caden Green later today. I'll be up in Kansas City for that one. I've had a crystal ball in for Caden Green since last May. Just had a feeling very early on that kid was going to be a Sooner. And if you're familiar with his background, you kind of understand that, right? You know why he's got such an affinity for the University of Oklahoma and has for quite some time. Now, Peyton Kirkland, when I tell you that is one of the most well-guarded and most camouflaged recruitments that I have ever covered, that is not hyperbole in the slightest. Nobody, and I mean nobody, knows where that kid is going right now. Everybody has their guesses. Nobody knows with any degree of certainty which hat he's going to put on come July 23rd. Oklahoma's in it. Florida's in it. Miami's in it. Michigan State is in it. Texas A&M has jumped in it late. But it's so hard to tell where the eventual destination for Peyton Kirkland is going to be. And even if you get late in the process like this, and I'll use Logan Howland as an example, right? It's been pretty clear for about the last month and a half that it was going to be either OU or Iowa for Logan Howland. I don't even know if anybody can point to an either or for Peyton Kirkland, because there are at least four, maybe five schools that are legitimately in the mix right now and could very legitimately end up with his commitment. And you get so much conflicting intel from so many people that are plugged into the situation that at the end of the day, and it's very rarely in covering recruiting do you come to a point at which you just throw your hands up in the air and say, I have no idea. But everybody's about at that point with Peyton Kirkland. And maybe there's more clarity over the next week, 2 weeks leading into his announcement. But right now, man, nobody knows. Nobody knows with any degree of certainty. And I'm not going to sit here and act like I do, because if anybody tells you they do, they're lying.
That's wild. That's wild.
Yeah, that is interesting. So I've got one more question for you regarding a couple other recruits that are currently committed to other schools. And this has been well documented, and a lot of people have been talking about it. They're from Denton, Texas. Peyton Bowen, Ryan Yates, Peyton's with Notre Dame, and then Yates is with LSU. This has been a hot topic. A lot of people have been talking about it. We've talked about it on the show multiple times. Not so much Ryan Yates, but a lot of Peyton Bowen. And obviously Jackson Arnold's there recruiting, trying to get them to come to Oklahoma. And Yates just earned an offer, over the last month or so. Do you see Bowen and Yates? Do you see that being a legitimate shot for Oklahoma? I'm just curious what your opinion is on those two.
Well, how much faith do you have in Jackson Arnold? I think that's what it boils down to, because he's teammates with both Bowen and Yates, and he is working harder than anybody to get those two flipped to Oklahoma. Now, as you mentioned, the Sooners have been pursuing Bowen and working on flipping him for a long time. I mean, it was one of the first things the staff did once they got their wits about them. After closing the 2022 class the way they did, they turned their focus to 2023. And one of the guys that they keyed on very early on in the process was Peyton Bowen, because OU had led for him until the old staff simply quit recruiting him for whatever reason, Lord knows why. And he committed to Notre Dame on New Year's Day. And there's been a belief behind the scenes for probably 4 to 5 months now, at least, that Peyton Bowen's flip to Oklahoma was coming. It was a matter of when, not if. But here we are, guys, and it's early July, and Bowen's still pledged to Notre Dame, even though he's taken several visits to Oklahoma. He's taken a visit to Texas A&M. He's taken a visit to Alabama. It's interesting, isn't it, that the only place he's visited multiple times is Oklahoma, and I think he's been to OU 5 times this calendar year. So that tells you that he's torn with it. Right? He hasn't decommitted from Notre Dame, which tells you some part of him still wants to be at Notre Dame. But the fact that he keeps coming back to OU tells you, you know what? Part of him wants to end up in Norman and room with his buddy Jackson Arnold at the next level. Where I stand with it, though, is I wonder how long it is before the OU staff simply decides to move on. How much longer are they going to play tug of war with Peyton Bowen before they simply say, look, we got other guys on the board. We want you and we like you, but we can't keep doing this back and forth. We got to go find guys that know they want to be here. How much longer is it before the OU staff gives Peyton Bowen that ultimatum? Because they've offered several more safeties over the last few weeks. Conrad Hussey, who's committed to Penn State, Ben Minich out of the state of Iowa, who's uncommitted, but is starting to earn some big time Power 5 looks. And obviously Ryan Yates is one of their recent offers at the position. I think the Sooners have better odds to flip Yates than they do Bowen at this point in time. His pledge to LSU has always been rather soft, and it always kind of seemed like he was just committing there to lock in a spot. He hasn't really made it any secret that he's looking around over the last few months. And I think it's a very realistic chance that he ultimately flips to Oklahoma. Look, if you go 1 for 2 with the Geyer kids, I think that's a win. If you're Oklahoma and you're this OU staff, particularly Brandon Hall, it's a win. If you go 1 for 2, you can realistically go 2 for 2. That's not out of the realm of possibility, but it just comes down to how much longer are you going to play the game? How much longer are you willing to play the game with Peyton Bowen?
I just have one more question to wrap up, unless you boys have a couple more questions, but it's unrelated to recruiting. But I got the Plant the Flag sweatshirt on for this. What are your thoughts on the news of Baker finally getting out of Cleveland? And also, how cool is it that his first game as a Panther is against the Browns?
Well, I'll be honest with you. For Baker's sake, I wanted him in Seattle. I wanted him throwing to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. But I think the situation that he lands in Carolina is an intriguing one in that he's not going to be asked to do a whole heck of a lot just because the bread and butter of that offense is Christian McCaffrey. But he's got some nice receiving weapons. Right? He's got DJ Moore. He's got Robbie Anderson. He's got Rashard Higgins. And so, there's some familiarity there with Higgins, but also there's some viable playmakers in the passing game for Carolina. And obviously McCaffrey is an outstanding pass catching back. That week 1 game against Cleveland in Charlotte is going to be must-see TV. But the way I look at it, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for anybody other than Baker Mayfield to be the Panthers week 1 starter in 2022. I've never at any point drank the Kool-Aid or even sipped the Kool-Aid on Sam Darnold. I don't believe in him at all. And I'm completely unashamed to admit that. They did draft Matt Corral. They do have PJ Walker on the roster. They also have Davis Cheek on the roster. I'm not convinced he's a real person, but apparently he's on the roster as well. You look at that quarterback room and, Baker Mayfield's going to be the starter, barring injury or barring an atrocious training camp for the ages. He's going to be the starter in Carolina. And look, for both parties, this is a 1-year fling, more or less. It's Baker's chance to prove that he deserves a long-term contract, whether in Carolina or elsewhere, to be the starter. And it's Carolina, a program that has struggled to find consistency and stability at the quarterback position ever since Cam Newton's first tenure with the team ended. It's an opportunity for them to throw a low-risk option out there. Very low risk, very high reward option at the quarterback position. He's not going to have a whole lot of expectations on his shoulder. I also think Carolina, as an organization, as a fan base, they're just far more realistic about what they are than the Cleveland Browns, right? The Browns were willing to run Mayfield out of town after he didn't give them a second consecutive double-digit win campaign and playoff victory, which was more than anyone had done for that franchise since their reinception in 1999. So for Carolina, they can throw Mayfield out there for 17 games. If it pans out, great. You can lock him up for 3 or 4 more years, and he's your answer at the quarterback position. If it doesn't work out, or say Matt Corral really comes on strong and you think he's your future, well, guess what? You can go your own way. The two parties can allow their paths to diverge. And at that point, I think if Mayfield hasn't proven that he's capable of being a full-time starter in the league, he takes the Ryan Tannehill road, right? He takes the Tannehill approach and goes somewhere where maybe he's not expected to be the week 1 starter come 2023, but he's going to have the opportunity to at least battle for that starting job. And if there's one thing we know about Baker, man, he is competitive as all get out. And he plays the game with a chip on his shoulder. There's no doubt in my mind that if he goes somewhere else, somewhere other than Carolina in 2023, and he's in a legitimate battle for a job, that he's going to come out on the victorious end because it's all he's ever done.
I agree. You guys got anything else?
I do not, Jose. You don't either. No, I agree. That game 1, that week 1 game matchup of Carolina and the Browns, I can't wait for. I think Baker's going to have a great bounce back season. He's going to have a chip on his shoulder, and that's typically when he plays his best. But we just wanted to say, Parker, we really appreciate you coming on. And something that we do around here is Brandon's end of video challenge. At the end of every video, he has the viewers, comment on their opinions on things. Brandon, what do you have for us?
Yeah, well, we have Parker Thune, OU Insider, on, so we're going to talk just the recruiting class because that's a big thing people like to talk about. I know on this show we talk all the time that we believe it could be a top 10, if not higher. So I know we've probably asked it before, but guys, comment where you think this class finishes up. And Parker, where do you think it finishes up? I guess we'll finish with that.
Yeah, that's a great
if
question.
You can.
And I would say right now I'm projecting that Oklahoma concludes this cycle anywhere in the 5 to 9 range. And I think 5 is probably the ceiling. I think the floor is probably 11 or 12. If they somehow end up with a class that's outside the top 12, I think that's where the staff opens themselves up to some criticism. But I think the wheels would have to fall off in catastrophic fashion for that to occur, because they've got a lot of guys already that are 100% bought in, and also very talented football players, guys that are going to be on the rise up the rankings as the summer gives way to the fall. So I think somewhere in that 5 to 9 range, I split the difference, I guess, number 7. If I had to pick one number, I'll say they finished the cycle with the number 7 class overall. But there is no doubt in my mind that they conclude the cycle with a top 10 class. That is the baseline expectation for me.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, for sure. I know Jose and I don't know, Brandon, if you were on that show, but we talked about it. And I was saying worst case scenario in my mind. I really think 6 or 7, 5 to 7 is that spot where you could really end up, and they could end up at 8 or 9, but 7 is good.
Yeah, and I'll add this, as our VIPs over at OUinsider.com know, I actually did a mock class projection just a couple days ago, and I kept it pretty conservative. Didn't include David Hicks, didn't include Malachi Coleman, didn't include guys like Amari Washington and Kelby Collins. So I kept it very realistic. Some would even say pessimistic. And the class that I projected for the Sooners with 25 commits would have ranked 5th in last year's cycle. So if that gives you any frame of reference for just how good this class can be, especially if guys like Picciotti, I always want to pronounce it wrong, Picciotti, Keon Brown, even a guy like Cade McIntyre, a guy like Caleb Spencer, if those guys continue to rise up the rankings the way I expect that they will, the Sooners definitely have an outside shot to grab a top 5 class.
That's great. I mean, I'm excited. I know everyone that's watching this is probably really excited too. And we just wanted to say again, we appreciate it for you coming on, and hopefully we can have you on in the future, and we can make this a little more regular over the next few months going into the football season. If you made it this far, like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton. Turn that notification bell so you know when we post. We're going live Monday night, July 11th at 8 p.m. Central. So be sure to join us then. And be sure to follow us on our social medias, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Everything's linked below. And leave us a review on Apple and Spotify if you're listening on there currently. And we really appreciate it. And we will see you guys Monday.